Most people assume Sophie Simmons had it easy growing up around rock legends, but what she actually experienced was something very different. She didn't grow up thinking she was surrounded by icons. She thought they were just her parents' friends. And by the time she realized who those people really were, she was already dealing with pressures no one had prepared her for. Sophie Simmons has spent years quietly navigating that gap between perception and reality. And when she finally started talking about it, the story turned out to be far more complicated than anyone expected. A childhood that didn't feel famous. Sophie Simmons didn't grow up the way people imagine a rock star's daughter would. Yes, her father was Gene Simmons, one of the most recognizable figures in rock music, and her mother, Shannon Tweed, was a well-known actress and model. But inside their home, none of that carried the weight it did outside. In fact, Sophie has admitted that she didn't even understand how famous the people around her were. She once explained it in a way that almost sounds surreal in hindsight. "My dad will say, 'You've met that person. They were at the house.' And I won't remember that I met them," she said. What stands out isn't just the forgetfulness, it's the context. These weren't casual acquaintances. These were major figures in music, but no one around her treated them that way. "No one expressed to me the importance of these people when I was younger. They were just like, 'This is our friend.'" That small detail explains a lot about how Sophie processed her early life. Fame wasn't something she learned from inside the house. It was something she discovered later, almost from the outside looking in. But that sense of normalcy didn't last. At just 11 years old, Sophie became part of Gene Simmons' Family Jewels, the A&E reality show that followed her family's life from 2006 to 2012. Suddenly, the private version of her world was replaced with a public one. Cameras were present during moments that most kids experience quietly: growing up, figuring out identity, making mistakes. And unlike most children, she didn't have the option to separate those moments from an audience. She later reflected that her parents tried to keep things grounded. They were, in her words, strong and down-to-earth people, and they did what they could to make her upbringing feel normal. But there's a difference between trying to create normalcy and actually living it. The show made sure of that. What people didn't notice at the time was how early that exposure started shaping her decisions. By the time the show ended in 2012, Sophie wasn't just a teenager figuring out what she liked. She was someone who had already been watched, judged, and quietly compared to an image she hadn't chosen. And that pressure didn't disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. It simply changed form. The moment she realized normal didn't apply to her. When Gene Simmons' Family Jewels ended in 2012, Sophie Simmons was at an age where most people are just beginning to figure out who they are. But for her, that process came with a layer of visibility that never really turned off. The cameras were gone, but the expectations stayed. What stands out is how quickly she tried to step into something that didn't actually fit her: modeling. On paper, it made sense. She had grown up around image, around appearances, around a world where visibility often translates into opportunity. But the reality of that industry hit her almost immediately. Sophie has been very direct about what those experiences felt like. She described walking into photo shoots where stylists would bring sample-size clothing, size 0, even though they already knew her measurements. "Hi, I'm an 8. Please don't bring a 0. I won't fit in it," she recalled telling them. And yet it kept happening. The pattern matters more than any single moment. It wasn't one bad experience. It was repetition. Over and over again, she was placed in situations where the expectation was clear, even if no one said it out loud. You are supposed to fit into this. And when you don't, the responsibility quietly shifts onto you. She described how that dynamic starts to change the way you think. Not immediately, but gradually. You begin to question yourself instead of the system. You start going, "Oh, should I really be fitting into that? Like, is it my fault?" That's the part most people miss. It wasn't just about clothing sizes. It was about how easily external standards become internal doubts. Her mother, Shannon Tweed, played an important role during this period, but not in the way people might expect. Instead of pushing her to adapt, she gave her permission to stop. Sophie has said clearly that her mom told her she didn't have to do it, that no one was expecting her to become something she wasn't comfortable with. That kind of support doesn't erase the experience, but it changes the direction. Eventually, Sophie stepped away from modeling altogether, but what replaced it wasn't immediate clarity, it was hesitation. Because the one thing she had always loved, music, was also the one thing she was most afraid to pursue. The career she avoided the most. Walking away from modeling didn't immediately solve anything for Sophie Simmons. It just removed one pressure and revealed another. One that had been there the entire time. Music. From the outside, it would seem obvious. Her father was Gene Simmons. Music was part of the environment she grew up in. But that was exactly the problem. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like something that already had expectations attached to it. Sophie has been clear about why she resisted it. I was always writing songs my whole life, but it wasn't something I considered doing as a career. I didn't want to be compared. That hesitation wasn't about ability. It was about identity. She didn't want to be seen as an extension of someone else's success. What people didn't notice at the time was how far she went to test herself without that safety net. In 2012, instead of leveraging her last name, she auditioned for the X Factor. She chose a song that carried weight, Adele's version of Bob Dylan's To Make You Feel My Love. It wasn't an easy choice, and it wasn't meant to impress casually. It was meant to answer a question she had been asking herself. Is this actually good? Or do people just think it is because of who I am? She made it through the initial rounds and reached boot camp. Then she was eliminated. That moment matters more than it looks on paper. Because for Sophie, it wasn't just a setback. It was confirmation. Not of failure, but of legitimacy. Someone outside her family had said yes, even briefly, and that was enough for her to keep going. Still, the path forward wasn't smooth. When she tried to get meetings with labels and publishers, she couldn't even get in the room. That's the part that contradicts the public narrative. The assumption is that being the daughter of a rock icon opens doors. But Sophie described something very different. Doors that stayed closed. The only people telling me they liked my songs were my parents, she said. And that wasn't enough for her. It couldn't be. So instead of waiting for approval, she started building something on her own. Writing, recording, collaborating. Not in the spotlight, but in smaller, quieter spaces where her name didn't carry the same weight. What stands out here is how deliberate that process was. She didn't try to sound like Kiss. In fact, she moved in the opposite direction, electronic, pop, songwriting for other artists. Not because it was easier, but because it was hers. And even then, the resistance didn't go away. It just came from a different place, building a voice that didn't belong to Kiss. By the time Sophie Simmons started releasing her own music, she had already made one decision very clear. She wasn't going to follow the sound people expected from her. There was no attempt to recreate what Gene Simmons had built. No rock image, no theatrical persona, no effort to connect to that audience in a familiar way. Instead, she moved towards something quieter and more internal. Her early releases, including songs like Black Mirror, Paper Cut, and If I Could, leaned into electronic and pop influences. Black Mirror, in particular, came from a very specific place. She explained that the idea started while watching the Netflix series of the same name, thinking about how much of modern life happens through screens and how relationships are filtered through that distance. It wasn't a grand statement. It was an observation. And that tone carried through the rest of her work. At the same time, she wasn't just writing for herself. She began working behind the scenes, writing for other artists across different genres, dance, pop, even rap. In 2016, she wrote a song for rapper Rick Ross, something her father openly admitted he didn't fully connect with musically. That detail says more than it seems to. It shows how intentionally she stepped outside of the world she came from, even when it meant creating something her own family wouldn't naturally gravitate toward. But independence came with its own complications. There's a common assumption that second-generation artists have an easier path. Sophie has pushed back on that idea directly. She pointed out that if that were true, she would already be at the top of the charts, signed to major deals, surrounded by built-in opportunities. Instead, she described a very different reality, one built on networking, recommendations, and slow progress. "I'm a completely independent artist and songwriter," she said. "It's a grind. What stands out here is not just the work itself, but the context around it." Her father, who came from an era of physical records and large-scale touring, didn't fully understand the current system. At one point, he even told her he didn't think she should pursue music, not because of her talent, but because of how difficult it had become to make a living in the industry. That concern didn't stop her, but it did shape how she approached everything. She wasn't chasing visibility in the same way her father once had. She was building something smaller, more controlled, and more personal, and that personal side started to show more clearly in the way she wrote. Not just songs, but something else entirely. What she finally said about it all. By the time Sophie Simmons started speaking more openly about her life, the story people thought they understood had already shifted. She wasn't trying to correct it directly, but the details she shared made it clear that growing up around Kiss didn't define her in the way most people assumed. If anything, it created distance. That becomes obvious in the way she talks about her work now. Music for her isn't about performance in the traditional sense. It's more private, almost protective. When she released her poetry book, Secrets I Would Never Say, But I Would Sing, she described it as a place for thoughts she wouldn't say out loud, things she couldn't post on social media, things she wouldn't tell people directly. "It's a personal form of therapy," she said, "an outlet to get everything out, so I can better understand what I'm feeling." That idea connects back to everything that came before. The early exposure, the pressure to fit into an image, the constant awareness of how she was being seen. What stands out is that instead of pushing further into visibility, she found a way to step slightly away from it, even while staying in the same industry. Her relationship with her father reflects that balance too. At one point, she mentioned asking him if they could write a song together. Not for release, not for an audience, just for themselves. "It would be such a shame to go our whole lives and never have written a song together," she said. The detail matters because it shows how she separates personal connection from public identity. Even something as natural as a father-daughter collaboration becomes something she wants to keep private. And then there's the part of her life that people tend to focus on now. Her relationship with James Henderson. They met in a way that feels almost disconnected from everything else in her story. He was her waiter at a cafe in Los Angeles in 2014. She wrote her number on a receipt, added the word brunette so he'd know which one she was, and ran out. Years later, after nearly a decade together, he proposed in Zurich while her family was taking what she thought was just another photo. Gene Simmons later recalled the moment. As he posed, James dropped to one knee and he simply gasped. That reaction says more than any statement, not because of the surprise, but because of what it represented. "I'm not ready," he admitted later. "One second she's just a pair of cheeks with little legs walking around. Next second she's a grown woman." The wedding itself followed the same pattern Sophie had built her life around. Intentional, personal, and slightly outside of expectation. A courthouse ceremony, followed by a small gathering at her mother's Malibu home. Around 50 people. No religious framing, because their families came from different beliefs. Vows rewritten to remove traditional language about obedience. A setting designed to feel equal, not symbolic. She even surprised her father during the ceremony with a song she had written for him, Daddy's Girl. Not as a performance, but as a moment. That's the thread running through everything. She didn't reject where she came from. She just refused to let it define how she moved forward. So when you look at Sophie Simmons now, does her story feel like what you expected or something completely different? Let me know what surprised you the most. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.